Hey everyone, today I will be painting a black vulture in gouache, and I thought I would talk about the process but also where this piece came from and some of the inspiration behind it. So as far as my drawing goes, to make sure this is centered in my sketchbook, I looked at my reference photo and that composition as a whole, found the vertical center of that which happened to be in line with the left leg, and then marked the center on my page so I could draw everything in relation to it. This helped me make sure it was lined up nicely. I'm using the Canson Artist Series Watercolor sketchbook for this. I love these sketchbooks for gouache. They're my favorite. I have so many and they're really cheap. I'll link it in the description below for you guys. The next step is to just lay down the basics of his form and try to capture them in really interesting shapes. So for his body, I have this kind of upside down tear shape, and for the wing, I've added a little bit of curvature to the sides and added some interesting angles at the top. This makes it more compelling to look at than say if I had just drawn an oval or trapezoid for the wing. And not only am I trying to make interesting shapes with, say, the obvious things like his wing, but also what shapes do the negatives of those shapes make? You know, like how interesting is the shape between the back and the left side of the wing? And you know, sometimes you just start over because your vulture looks more like a duck than a vulture. Happens to the best of us. So to get the beak down better than last time, I made sure to pay attention to the outline of the vulture, or you could say the negative space around the beak and neck, because it was a much easier shape to draw than forcing my head to understand the intricacies of the neck and the beak and the pointy tip all put together. Always try to find the easiest shape to work from when you're unsure, and you'll make your drawings a lot easier, way more fun, and a lot more accurate too. So a little background on this piece. For my birthday the month before, I got a copy of the Sibley Guide to Birds, and it's honestly one of my favorite books. I love birds, and this book has so many great illustrations by David Sibley. I'll link it below in the description if you want to check it out. I highly recommend it. I had really been wanting to give myself some sort of art challenge, so I decided I'd paint a bird from the book every day for November. So I get a random number, go to that page, and paint whatever bird I landed on. It was super fun and helpful, and I'll be making a video on it really soon, and I'll show my process and the whole sketchbook, so definitely subscribe if you want to be notified when it comes out. For this piece in particular, I was trying to challenge myself to use thicker paint. Up to this point, I had been painting with really thin layers and trying to force it to blend like watercolors, which is not bad necessarily. I just wanted this one to have a more opaque matte look that's kind of the usual gouache look. You'll see I finally get bold enough here to lay down a thicker layer of paint. I was super excited to get a vulture for one of my birds because if you ever followed my Instagram, you'll know that I did a vulture in my super realistic pencil style back in 2018. But instead of it taking months, I painted this in a day, so that's really cool. I really like vultures because they're just such weird birds. Like most birds are enjoyed for their majesty, but like this bird is literally as bald as like an old man, so they don't get dead rotting flesh on their feathers. Also, one of the highest flying birds, and some sources say the highest flying bird, is a type of vulture, which I think is majestic in its own right. And my last favorite fact about them, when you see several of them eating a carcass, it's called a wake. So amazing. Here, I'm laying down a really dark navy blue that's almost black. I'm using the Winsor & Newton Designer's Gouache Interest at a 10 for all of my pieces this month. So it's the ultramarine from that set in the Van Dyke Brown, which is really similar to a burnt umber. And this color will basically be the highlights or the sheen to these really dark black feathers. So this is the part of the painting where I'm trying to get as much paint coverage as I can and start tackling all the different areas. I'm starting to build up the rough texture of the back feathers with really loose abstract strokes, and then also lay down this weird transition from his bald skin to the feathers. Just for reference, this piece ended up being a little shy of 3 hours, which is about the longest I spent on any of these pieces. This is a 5.5 by 8.5 size sketchbook, so it was really perfect for getting a good sized piece but not taking all day long. I'm just building up some small hair and feather texture here by layering a bunch of short brush strokes with a small round brush. As I'm starting on the wing, I noticed it was a lot closer to the light source, so there's a lot more detail in the color here and some lighter values. The brown color is that Van Dyke brown I mentioned earlier, and the zinc white to make it chalky, which helped to kind of neutralize it. I also probably added a touch of blue just to take the redness out of it and make it a really subtle brown. For the feather texture at the bottom of the wing, I lifted some of the white gouache with a thirsty brush. If you're not experienced with lifting, that's just getting a brush that's damp, so dry off most of the water after you cleaned it in fresh water, and then it'll just absorb any wet paint that hasn't soaked in yet. Going back to my goal of trying to get a really thick gouache style on this piece, I'm going to lay down a way more opaque layer on the wing. You can see with the blue, it's also a very neutral, subdued blue. I'm basically mixing the blues and browns together so they get really unsaturated, and this will also help to harmonize the colors together. I'm starting to apply feathers with a color that's slightly darker than the brown I initially laid down here, and then I'm using a small detail brush for these really fine lines. I noticed something interesting though, and I'm not sure if this is a thing that happens with gouache or what, but the paint seemed to soak into the previous layer and just like disappear. I might have had too watery of a mix, or maybe I just mixed the same exact shade and it's just drying lighter, which also might be it. If you've never used gouache before, the darks do tend to dry lighter and the lights tend to dry darker, so it can be really tricky at times. My solution for this was to just layer over it a couple of times. This worked well anyway because I wanted to create some variety on the wing and make sure I captured all the different feather types. Now that I have most of the big shapes I want down, besides the feet and the wood he's perched on, it's time to start adding the little details in these transition areas that you don't pay a lot of attention to but still have to be there to sell the piece as a whole. This is probably my least favorite part and one of the hardest parts in my opinion. It's really where it all starts to come together and you have to learn how to make sure these different sections look cohesive. Like, no one is thinking and looking at these random tail feathers at the back, but if you don't have them, your piece just wouldn't read right. For the legs, this color I'm laying down is zinc white, again mixed with a little bit of ultramarine and Van Dyke brown to make this light gray. I feel like I keep mentioning the same colors over and over, and now that I think about it, besides a little red in the beak, I did basically paint all of this with just those colors. I did also use a little bit of solid black for parts of the chest, but it really goes to show you don't need a ton of colors to get started. But also, I'm not one to really talk about minimalism when it comes to supplies, so if you're like me and there's nothing better than getting new art supplies, you do you, buy all the supplies. So off of my personal vices and back to the art, it's time to start wrapping up and move on to the final details. I'm working on finishing up the feet now by adding some shadows to the top, and I'll also start on the wood, and you can probably guess what colors I used for this. Once the paint is fully dry, I can just go back and clean up any sketching lines. So these erasers are my absolute favorite, and yes, they are just the Pentel eraser pens you can buy from a grocery store. I love them. I want the wood to be super loose and abstract so it doesn't take away from the Vulture. My dog makes a cameo, and also it'll help to imply texture of the wood without having to paint tiny details. So I laid down this base brown color and then added some lighter brush strokes and then a darker color for these shadows between the two stumps to get this really nice wood look. For the really wrinkly and textured skin, I mixed shades that were just slightly darker than wherever I was working on. I kind of dabbed at it with a small brush. Occasionally I draw squiggly lines that kind of intersect with each other to show a more defined wrinkle. You'll see I do a similar approach for the fine hair around his head at the end of this video. And now as I finish up, I just wanted to thank you guys for stopping by and watching. As always, I appreciate the support so much. Please like this video if you found it helpful, and like I mentioned earlier, I'll be releasing a sketchbook walkthrough of all my birds from this month really soon, so definitely subscribe if you want to be notified when that comes out. Feel free to comment and let me know what you guys would like to see more of on this channel, and as always, take care guys. I'll see you next time.